Our next chapter, Chapter 3, is about attitudes and job satisfaction, almost the heart of the model of organizational behavior, because what is a legitimate goal of organizational behavior aside from improving the attitude and improving job satisfaction? So, first we have to start with defining what is an attitude. Well, an attitude is an evaluative statement, either favorable or unfavorable, concerning objects, people, or events, and really more so than an individual statement, a series of statements or a state of mind, the way a person views either a person, an event, a place, and in this case, a job, a company, a goal, a long-term aspiration of the company. Does it measure up? Is it in sync with what the employee wants? Is it in sync with the person working for the company wants? Obviously, if the attitude is the same, if the employee wants the same long-term goal as the company, you're likely to have a better overall attitude. And there are a few different components of attitudes. We've got the cognitive. And sorry, I just stuck this little definition in here for you because I think it's important. It's going to be an important word in this chapter. Cognition, or cognitive, means relating to cognition, but cognition means the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. In other words, when you study something, when you try to learn a process, when you try to remember something, that's all cognition. And so cognitive evaluation, or a cognitive attitude, is what you think about. You make a decision that this is not the way I'd want to go. This does not align with my goals. Or this does align with my goals. This is the right company for me. A decision, something that you think about and something that you make a decision based on a thought process. That's cognitive. It's an evaluation. You've made a judgment. You've made a decision based on that. Then there's affective. In other words, your gut feeling. I dislike my supervisor, or I dislike this company's goals, or I dislike what I'm doing, I dislike my job. It may not necessarily be 100% rational, but it's just as real. And people's emotional reaction to their job or people's emotional reaction to their boss could be as important as their cognitive reaction, which is the reaction that's based on a careful thought process. And then there is behavioral. Okay, the attitude's based on what has been done or not done. I'm looking for other work. I've complained about my supervisor to anyone who would listen, and nobody's listened. Nobody's fixed it. And so therefore there's a behavioral problem where the company has done so many wonderful things. That's a behavioral attitude. All of these things go into building up a person's attitude towards a company. What has the company done and what has the person done for the company in the past? It's behavioral. A logical thinking about it, that's cognitive. And then, of course, you've got the emotional idea, the affective idea of just kind of the gut feeling, which we don't really exactly know what goes into a person's gut feeling, but it could be a lot of very subtle factors and could depend on the person's personality or character as well. Next, we have a very interesting idea of the relationship between attitude and behavior, and that's this idea of the cognitive dissonance, a phrase that you hear all the time. You hear it in politics, you hear it when people are accusing each other of saying things that are wrong. Then this person is suffering from cognitive dissonance, and usually they don't mean it to be sympathetic. Usually they mean it is some sort of criticism. Cognitive dissonance means an inconsistency between two or more attitudes, between behaviors and attitudes. This is the sort of thing that all of us have all the time. Cognitive dissonance means we're unsure, we're ambivalent. We have attitudes on both sides. We want something, but we don't want something. We want this house, but we're kind of worried that it's too gaudy, or worried that the mortgage is too high. We want it and we don't want it. And all of us experience this cognitive dissonance to one degree or another. And one of the ways we deal with it is by rationalization. We seek to minimize dissonance, and the way we do this to ourselves is by convincing ourselves that we really don't want it if we don't have it, or that we really want it if we do have it. We throw away the bad side if we're getting it, and we throw away the good side if we're not getting it. There's one example here that I wanted to bring up the old fable by Aesop. I guess that's, I don't know, Greek or something. Uh, the Fox and the Grapes. You've probably never heard this before, but the famous Fox and the Grapes little fable is that one summer the fox was strolling through and came to the orchard, saw the grapes, etc., etc. I don't have to read the whole thing with you, and jumped up and tried to get the grapes, tried to get the grapes, tried to get the grapes, couldn't do it. And at last she turned away and said, "The grapes are sour and not ripe enough, as I thought." And the idea is the fox despised what she couldn't get. In other words, the fox couldn't get the grapes, and so she convinced herself that she really didn't want it in the first place. That's this idea of rationalization where we say, well, okay, I wanted the grapes, but now I didn't want them, and so therefore, once I can't get them, that now I figure out a way to convince myself that I really didn't want them in the first place. That's this idea of rationalization. And this idea, the extent to which cognitive dissonance and rationalization can affect a person's attitude depends on a lot of factors. It could be the sort of thing that can be controlled. It could be the sort of thing that could run out of control. You could have the importance of the elements creating the dissonance. How critical are they to the people? Are people able to let go of negative feelings towards something? And if you have ambivalencies, if you have kind of counteracting feelings towards something, how important are those feelings? Can they be let go? The degree of influence that he or she, the individual, believes that he has control over the elements. Do you think you can control them? If you think you can control them, well, then you're less likely to be stymied and almost paralyzed by cognitive dissonance because you know you can control it. If you think, for example, that, well, this is going to be very hard for me to do, so I'm kind of ambivalent as to whether to take this job, but if you know that you can come through and raise your game, so to speak, well, then it's less likely to affect you. The rewards that may be involved in the dissonance, how much of an incentive do you have to try to make sure that you can to move along. And of course, attitudes can also be changed by behavior. That behavior can be the person with the attitude, or that behavior can be from other people in the social circles of that person. What about the relationships with other people who are having influence over the person? You have to look at things like how important are those people, correspondence, how is the reaction to the behavior, accessibility, social pressures, direct personal knowledge, knowing attitudes help predict behavior. In other words, the idea is there are so many different variables that affects a person's attitude. When somebody is looking at an an organizational behavior plan to try to improve people's attitudes, they have to look at all these factors. They have to look at, okay, you want to try to get people to feel better about the company. What are the influences on this person going to be? Are there going to be pressures in the workforce to stand up against the boss, or are there going to be pressures in the workforce to try to improve the company? Maybe incentive packages will get the people to try to establish an attitude of cooperation and an attitude of trying to build the company. These are all things that have to be thought about. Next, we're going to turn to kind of a laundry list of job attitudes, how you measure those attitudes, and just some interesting facts about them, I suppose, in this chapter of attitudes. What are some of the major job attitudes? Well, number one, you've got job satisfaction. Job satisfaction is probably an overarching something that encompasses most of the rest of the things that we're going to discuss. How satisfied is the employee with his or her job? Obviously, the more satisfied the employee is, the less likely the employee is to leave, and the more likely the employee is to put in top-level effort to try to be as productive as possible. Involvement in the job. How much is the employee involved in making the decisions that are relevant to the job, or is the employee's job simply rote and simply a non-decision-making capacity? Psychological empowerment. In other words, how much is the person's psyche and what the person wants to do taken into account? Somebody who's a high manager and can really be creative and can use all of his or her creative faculties is more likely to be satisfied with a job than somebody who is pigeonholed and told to do X, Y, Z, and that's that, regardless of whether you think that's the correct thing to do. Organizational commitment. How committed is the organization to that person's job and to having that person work in that capacity? Effective commitment, and I just stuck little definitions over here for your benefit. Affective commitment means the emotional attachment to the organization, the affect, or which is similar to the emotion. How emotionally invested and tied up are you with the organization? Obviously, the more you love your company, the harder you're going to work for the company. The more you hate your company, the more you're just going to try to get away with whatever minimal amount of work you can do to get your paycheck and go home. Continuous commitment, which is the gain versus losses of working in an organization. In other words, every person, when working for an organization, is constantly evaluating, is this good for my long-term career? Is this good for my family? And that's one of the more important attitudes that a person can have. Is this the sort of thing that's worth it for me to work full-time, long-term, or is it the sort of thing where I should really be looking for other jobs in other organizations? And a normative commitment means in a situation where you commit to and remain with an organization because of a feeling of obligation. It's similar, it's kind of almost like a combination of affective and continuance, but the idea, do I feel a commitment not only to the company but to the co-workers themselves personally, which could be as important. Perceived organizational support of the individual, and of course employee engagement, which is really kind of similar to job involvement and organizational commitment, which we discussed a little while ago. And the last part of the chapter looks at job satisfaction. Job satisfaction, as I mentioned before, kind of a conglomeration of many of these different aspects, which all lead to this idea of job satisfaction. If you feel the organization is committed to you, you have intellectual creativity, you have all those things, you get paid a lot, which which helps. Those are all things that are involved in satisfaction. And measuring job satisfaction can be very difficult because there are so many different criteria that go into it. How do you do that? Well, here are some different ways of looking at it. One thing you can do is you can have a global rating method which has a few general questions and can be accurate even though it's really only one number that has to be based on a whole bunch of different subparts. In the global rating method, you might be presenting the employee with just a couple of questions. How satisfied are you with your job? How much do you like your company? And base it on that. And now there are so many different subcategories that are involved in that one big question, but that's one method. It's obviously simpler to ask somebody, how satisfied are you with your job on a scale of 1 to 10? And even though you don't really get into the micro subparts, it can still be pretty accurate. Or you can do the summation score method, which identifies key elements of a job and asks for feelings about them. An example of the summation method is where you might ask the employee an entire series of questions or ask the employee to fill out a questionnaire. Something like, how secure do you feel in your job? High secure, or not secure? How do you feel about the smooth relationship with your employees and coworkers? Very high, very low, medium. And you can ask a whole bunch of these different questions. Have you ever experienced any of the following forms of discrimination in your company? Are you satisfied with your overall compensation package? How do you feel about the welfare scheme of your showroom? Not 100% sure what that means, but whatever. Are you satisfied with the bonus and incentives given? And there are tons and tons of these questions. Are my leaders positive role models? My responsibilities are reasonable. I have the materials to do well. I'm satisfied with my job. There could be 20 or 25 different questions, or more. Or there could be 100 questions. There's really no specific limitation on that. And you add up the total score in the end. Maybe you get 1 point for a bad answer, or a negative answer, 2 points for a medium answer, and 3 points for a good answer. And you kind of add them all up at the end and see what the overall score is. Now, the advantage of that, obviously, is that not only can you get maybe a more accurate score than just an overall perception, although the overall perception might be somewhat similar to the summative score, you can also kind of break it down, and you can say, well, employees in the organization are not satisfied. Yeah, but what are they not satisfied with? Are they not satisfied with the compensation package? Well, you can see that even though overall scores are good, the answer for the compensation package score was low on average among all 30 employees that you asked. So that's the sort of thing that you can take into account in that way. In terms of measuring job satisfaction, this is just in terms of how people, what people consider important. in terms of job satisfaction. The work itself actually very, very high. Overall is obviously going to be the highest relative to overall job satisfaction. But if you think about it, you look at this over here in terms of what studies show are the most important factors. The work itself is really the number one factor. Coworkers, supervision, and pay is down here, all the way down at the second to lowest, with only the possibility of promotion, which is important. I mean, these are all important, but relative to the others, the chances of promotion are actually a little bit less than some of the other things in terms of measuring job satisfaction. If you look over here at this study, I'm not sure exactly where this study comes from, but this shows that job satisfaction by country, the United States, pretty high, but not as high as, let's say, Mexico or Switzerland, Norway, Denmark. These are some of the Northern European countries over here have high, and then as you go further down, there are some countries with lower job satisfactions. Again, just an interesting little statistic, not necessarily anything that you need to memorize. Knowing how to improve job satisfaction, and thus overall employee morale and employee performance, depends on, how do you get job satisfaction? What causes job satisfaction? Well, we discussed a little while ago, or in the previous slide, the work itself was actually the number one correlation with overall satisfaction. Just, is the work easy? Is the work hard? Is it challenging? Does it require creativity? Is it the sort of thing that the employee thinks is utilizing his or her training? If I went to school for 5 years to become a lawyer, and they do nothing but have me photocopy things and make coffee, well, the pay might be good, and the people might be good, but I might not be satisfied because I'm going to say, hey, I didn't train for this. The social component, which also was very high on the list before, the social component, I think, was the coworkers, which was the second highest on the list, and supervision, of course, is also part of the your supervisor, your boss, is also part of the social component, and of course pay, which is not that well correlated after you've reached a level of comfortable living. So interestingly enough, if a person really needs, let's say, $50,000 to live comfortably, the difference between getting $100,000 and $120,000, in other words, somebody who's well above their comfort level, is not that well correlated to job satisfaction, which is interesting. It shows you things like the work itself and things like the behavior of the other people in the office are actually more correlated to employee satisfaction than the mere number that the person actually gets paid. What if you have dissatisfied employees? You have low job satisfaction. What kind of employees what kind of actions of the employees can you expect? Well, there are good ways to express dissatisfaction, and there are constructive ways, and then there are destructive ways. And the ways in which these can be expressed can be active, something that everybody realizes, or they could be passive, which is you don't necessarily announce that you're dissatisfied or satisfied. You just do something that helps or hurts the company. So, for example, an active, constructive thing to do would be to voice your concerns or voice your happiness or tell people. Well, that's a constructive way of doing things, and it's active. It's something that people notice. Exiting the company is also active. It's also the sort of thing that people have to notice by definition, and that's the sort of thing that obviously could be destructive to the company, which could be a consequence of dissatisfaction. Passive, which means the sort of thing that you don't necessarily announce, but in a constructive way. In other words, if you are helping the company, something to help the company would be expressing loyalty, staying with the company. That's not the sort of thing that is displayable. It's not the sort of thing that you know whether a person's going to stay or not, but long-term loyalty is something that highly satisfied employees do, whereas neglect of work would be a destructive, passive thing to do. And there are not just these 4 ways of expressing dissatisfaction or satisfaction. There are many more, but these are just some examples. What are some examples of the benefits of satisfaction? Well, thankfully there are a lot of them. There are better job and organizational performance overall, better organizational citizenship behaviors. In other words, how people interact with the other people in the environment. greater levels of customer satisfaction, lower turnover, lower absenteeism, lower instances of workplace deviance, which means doing things differently from the rest of the company. These are, again, all themes that we've been discussing over and over again, are some of the benefits of job satisfaction in the company.